The cemetery vote is a name applied to, I guess, generically to election fraud. In a lot of places, particularly in Arkansas and in southern states, one of the things that political bosses did was in close elections when you need votes late at night, you voted the dead people from the cemetery vote. So late at night they'd be filling out poll taxes from people who had died the last few years, and that was called the cemetery vote. So you couldn't count the ballots, you couldn't call the election until the cemetery vote was in. So thus the title of the book, Waiting for the Cemetery Vote. Election fraud in Arkansas is, I think, is kind of like election fraud throughout the South. And I think the kind of culture of election fraud probably can be traced back to Reconstruction era, shortly after the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction. And in the South, in particular in Arkansas and in Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana and Tennessee, there was a great struggle to regain control by the merchant class, the planters, the white business leaders, and the Democratic Party, which controlled the South. Great struggle to recapture government at every level, from the Republicans and the carpetbaggers and the scalawags and also the newly enfranchised blacks who had been freed during the Civil War and now became voters. So after Reconstruction, there was this great struggle to take the South back. And so particularly in the 1870s and the 1880s, you had this massive struggle. And in Arkansas, it culminated in elections of 1888. And that's how this book, Waiting for the Cemetery Vote, starts with that great struggle to capture the courthouses, the State House, and particularly a congressional seat. And it was such a titanic struggle that virtually everything went, and that including stealing ballots by the thousands, taking ballot boxes, throwing them in the river, intimidating people, terrorizing people. Serial murders occurred in that election, including the Republican candidate for Congress from a district east of Little Rock. The election was stolen from him, and he went to a little town called Marlton, Arkansas, to investigate it. After people he sent there to investigate the fraud either were chased away or disappeared. So he went there on his own to find out what happened, and he was murdered. And then after that, other people had to be murdered to keep it quiet. And there was kind of an acceptance of that in the community, because everybody understood that this was important, that your side won. So whatever was done to see that the right people got into office was permissible and acceptable. So in that instance, no one was, although there were dozens and perhaps hundreds of people were involved in all of that fraud, nevertheless, nobody was ever prosecuted. Nobody was punished for it. And even today, there are people in that community who trace their lineage back to people who were involved in that voting fraud. And my great-great-great-grandfather was in the room when they drew straws to see who was going to assassinate John Clayton. So that's kind of, at least that's the thesis of our book, is that that's became the basis of this political culture of vote theft in Arkansas, and why it was acceptable to everybody. Prosecuting attorneys never prosecute anybody, even when they're caught stealing votes. Nobody's ever prosecuted, because everybody does it after all, and you kind of understand why they did it. It's kind of a acceptable white-collar crime. After 1888, the Democratic Party in Arkansas and elsewhere throughout the South, the Democratic Party became the governing party without question. It was really unchallenged from Reconstruction until the 1970s and 1980s. The Democratic Party was unchallenged in the South. And so a lot of the fraud occurred within the Democratic Party ranks because the Republicans couldn't challenge. They didn't have the strength to challenge. So it was just kind of an acceptable part of the political regime. Motive is just simply to stay in power. If you're a politician, you always thought it was important that you stay in power, that you have almost God-given rights to govern, and all of your friends and supporters felt the same way. So whatever it was required to stay in power, you did it, and your friends accepted that, and even your enemies. The assumption is they would do it if they were in power, so they were reluctant as well to prosecute election fraud. Arkansas is kind of off the beaten path. We're an insular state, a rural state, and we never had much power. And from its inception, it was a kind of a backward state and never at the center of attention in the country. I guess the only time twice I guess Arkansas has caught the national attention, and that of course was in 1957 when Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to try to prevent integration at Central High School, setting off a constitutional crisis in this country. And the second time, of course, was in 1992 when our governor was elected president of the United States. Election fraud in Arkansas, and I think anyway, is much diminished. You've had some serial changes. First of all, in the 1960s, we got rid of the poll tax both in Arkansas and elsewhere in the South, which was an easy tool for political bosses to use to manipulate the vote. That went out in 1964. Then we had a permanent voter registration system, which cured some of the problems, made election fraud more difficult. And then we got voting machines, another reform in the 1960s and 1970s, and that also made some forms of election fraud more difficult. So I think elections are, by and large, much cleaner now than there were in that era, but there's still almost every election in Arkansas, particularly in eastern Arkansas, there are examples of fraud and investigations, and we never quite get to the bottom of them, and it goes up and down through the courts, but we never quite resolve those issues. But it's still around. Election fraud is still around. Now it kind of takes somewhat of a different form. Now there's more voter intimidation efforts now made to prevent people from voting blocks. And that's part of I think, a more predominant problem now than the actual stealing of votes. Well, Louisiana, of course, has the corner on colorful politicians, particularly with Huey Long, his brother Earl Long, both in Huey Long in the 30s, his younger brother Earl Long in the 40s and 50s. And then Edwin Edwards, who was convicted of various forms of fraud when he was governor of Louisiana. All of these are colorful characters. In Arkansas, we have our characters not quite as colorful, I guess. At least they don't get the country's attention like the Longs did. But Chicago also, you've got some colorful politicians in other states as well, but we just haven't got the national attention in Arkansas.